Welcome back to the Runner Zone podcast. You can see our faces now.
Yeah, these pretty mugs.
I know, right? We're moving up, Chris.
Yeah.
3 years. I think we've been doing this 3 or 4 years, all audio. So now we've got video. So we're moving up in the world.
Our pasty white mugs.
Yeah. Oh man, for sure. Yeah. What have you been up to? How's your week going?
The week is going great because our kids are finally back at school. Though our daughter she was on the fence today because her eye's been bothering her a little bit. But yeah, it's so peaceful and quiet here. I actually don't know what to do with myself.
Yeah, I drop on Thursdays. I drop my kids off. I do 7-year-old has to get to the bus stop, and then I drive the 4-year-old to preschool, which is a little bit on the other side of the town. And then I come back. And so, yeah, I got home at like 9:30. And then this morning, and so like the morning is just hectic because it's like, put your shirt on. Like you have to have gloves. It's cold outside, like just parenting. But then it's like, I've got so much done in the last 4 hours that I haven't been used to.
Yeah. Uninterrupted breaks. I mean, we talk about that a lot with the mastermind group that we run. It's like focus grasshopper.
Yeah. But today we're going to go back to the first episode we did. The very first episode we did, we talked about strength training for endurance athletes. And it's been a while. And so, you and I talk about this a lot, and figured it'd be good to kind of go back through kind of the state of things these days. The messaging that clinicians and coaches and athletes get, and then our experience doing this with runners and triathletes for the most part. So, I figured we'd start by going back to where, kind of our experiences with this, which I think for both of us predates even, going to PT school. So when was your first exposure to strength training and resistance training? And in the episode, we're going to keep that to like barbells, dumbbells, resistance bands, pretty much any kind of external resistance. What was your first exposure to that?
Growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at 129 Charrington Drive. I had a father who took to resistance training, and he used to lift in the basement. I think he was channeling his inner Rocky. My brother was a very avid weightlifter, trained with a guy named Scott Genslinger, who I think the legal world, law enforcement were actually searching for this guy. I don't know if there was some issues with steroids or whatnot, but long story short, I was around resistance training a lot. And I got a lens, and my dad would rig up this stuff with PVC pipe. He had a lat pull down machine. The one time I remember he pulled the thing down, it was attached to some rope that ended up getting compromised. And there was a bolt that went right into his head. We took him to the emergency room. So safety first, right? But I was also around when I was growing up, that time frame, North Hills High School football team was #1 in the country in 1987. And there are a group of guys who are my brother's age, a little bit older, and we all went to the local community pool. So I was hanging out with these guys all the time, and I got a lens into a lot of their resistance training. So, and I started lifting when I was about 12 years old. I remember doing some upright rows with a bent curl bar, which people still demonize for various reasons. But I would say I started really getting focused with my resistance training when I was in high school, and then obviously when I was in college. And I was a multi-sport athlete, and but I really started getting into it when I got to college, and I was playing tennis. I was a D1 tennis player, and ever since then I've stuck with it, and I've just continued to refine and probably more than anything simplify my approach to resistance training. How about you?
Yeah, very similar to you. So my parents were both very active when myself and my sister were young, and so I remember as a kid, I played basketball growing up, and I remember as a kid going to whatever gym they were a member of, because that was what you did back then. You just had a membership somewhere. This would have been the early 90s. And just playing basketball while my parents lifted weights. So my mom and my dad were both really, really strong in the early 90s. My dad was freaking jacked. And I remember as a kid, being in that environment kind of adjacent to it, because I just wanted to play basketball. So I'd go shoot and go through drills and that kind of stuff in the gym. But then when I got into about middle school, my dad, I started lifting weights with my dad in our basement. And at that point, we had these old sand weights. So these, they were red and black and gray, and they were filled with sand. And he started basically having me do, some of the stuff that he was doing, which was basically bodybuilding stuff. So it was, curls and overhead press and bench press and those kind of things. And so I got, exposed to that as a, 10, 11, 12-year-old. And then playing basketball growing up, the need to get stronger and be explosive, that kind of comes with the sport. And I'm not the springiest guy. So I remember going when I was a freshman or sophomore in high school, I started working with a trainer named Mark Thompson. And he basically ran like speed and agility stuff out of this big kind of community center called Sports City in Blue Springs. And he taught me how to do Olympic lifts, and we would do treadmill sprints and, cutting and acceleration and, squatting, deadlifting, lunging, like all the big movements. Even if I look back now, it was really good training. And that was really my first exposure to a quality lifting program. And I've always loved training. I think you're the same way. I've always loved doing those kind of things. Whether we're talking about basketball or running or cycling or lifting weights. And so just, fell to love it. And then, my first exposure to kind of programming this stuff was when I was in college. So, when I was home on summer breaks, I would go and train people in their homes. So, started as personal training. I would do that. And then I would do, basically the stuff that nobody else wanted to do. So I would do a lot of manual labor stuff in the summer, tear out fences and all those kind of things. And then I would go train people and, and then, got exposed to lots of good coaches over the years too. But, I've been around lifting, just as long as I've been around running. Hopefully now I can model some of the same things for my kids. My wife and I can model some of the same things for our kids. So it's been a while.
I think it's interesting that I think a lot of us do get introduced to resistance training through what we term bodybuilding. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
No.
I was doing similar to you, probably. I was doing some pressing. I was doing some upright rows. I was doing some curls. I was doing a lot of push-ups. I always found that stuff to be helpful. I was getting stronger. I always felt great. I did have an osichromiality, which is a weird sort of an atypical shoulder injury. And I don't know to what extent the resistance played into that. I think that was just more probably from being an overhead athlete. But we were talking about this before. I mean, Percy Sarity, he was onto this stuff several decades ago, what was he having his runners doing? I mean, he would have Herb Elliott do heavy cheek curls, heavy deadlifts, bench press. I mean, those are the three lifts that come to mind. And he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I didn't start running till I was in college. So I stopped playing basketball after I was out of high school and went to school at this small school up in Iowa and didn't have anything to do. And like I said, I always liked training. And I had ran a little bit growing up, but not a ton. And so I just started running, but still lifted. And even back then, I never had the stigma that runners a lot of times have, where resistance training is this negative thing. It's this thing to be feared. It's this thing to be avoided. I think that was definitely the approach to endurance sports and lifting when I was in college and definitely in PT school and right into practice. That's definitely shifted over the years to where it's a lot more common now. And I know with both of us, we both spend a good portion of our time doing this kind of stuff. with athletes. I mean, probably half of my schedule is working with runners and triathletes, either individuals or small groups or teams, and trying to implement resistance training for whether it's performance or whether it's, maybe there's been a specific injury history and we're trying to work on some things. But I spend about half my day thinking about that stuff now, or trying to help athletes with those kind of things. And I think as we've moved more towards resistance training being a good thing for endurance athletes, I think that maybe we go too far, which is kind of the motivation to have this conversation today, where it's not going to be the end all be all. It's not going to completely revolutionize your training if a bunch of other things aren't in order.
Yeah, and that's just the ultimate reminder that if you are a strength coach, if you're a healthcare professional, that before you go in and start pulling any levers, you have to sit down and have a lengthy chat to really get a lens into that athlete's ecosystem. I'm amazed. I'll be working with an athlete, and sometimes I don't get a piece of information till like a year or two into working with them that has such a profound impact. This happened last night with an athlete I was talking to, who was telling me about when they were growing up that they had a family member that would ration food for them, right? Crazy stuff. And, as I think about it now, I'm like, well, we need to get you into the hands of a nutritionist or an RD, because that's out of my jurisdiction. I'm not even going to pretend to know what I'm doing, but I want to get you to the right person. But I think that so often, especially I was guilty of this when I was younger, I thought I could swoop in and conquer the world. And now I'm much more reluctant to do that. I just want to sort of trot alongside someone, be like, hey, tell me what's going on. And obviously we want to help them with their sport and improve their performance, keep them training consistently. But I feel that the critical information often is outside of that. And that's taken, a lot of reps to finally appreciate that. And, as you and I both know, we're still on that journey of refining our processes and working with athletes.
Yeah. I mean, I first started kind of my side hustle at the time, which is now my business of, helping runners with resistance training my first year out of practice. So, I would train athletes during the day, train them before work, after work, group classes, one-on-one sessions. I've done this kind of stuff in a bunch of different ways. And yeah, man, at the time it was just throw volume at them. We're going to use this. You're going to be so strong. You're never going to get hurt. There was a lot of ego on my end of it. I think a really poor understanding of getting to know the athletes and trying to figure out what's the best thing for them, instead of just saying, well, more is better. Or, some of the things that we hear now, like just lift heavy, or you need to train certain muscles and different things like that. And, over the years, I hope that I've gotten better at trying to figure out, how do we implement this in the way that's helpful, doesn't overload you with stuff to do. And hopefully you enjoy it too, because I think there's naturally a tendency for a lot of runners to not really like resistance training. Maybe they've had a bad experience with it, with a coach they've worked with, a trainer or something else, or they just, when they've done it, they've gotten hurt or they're sore and it affects their running, and really trying to take it on a case-by-case basis. And I think that that's hard for a lot of runners to get that information now, because the way that we digest information is so quick with with the way that things go with social media now, where it's like, just do this, or here's 3 things for this. And not to say that those are inherently bad, but I think that everything that you assume is good can just as easily make things worse, So going back to my experience, like I've overprogrammed for a lot of runners, and we've ran into an injury or a bunch of poor performances, or, I haven't taken the time to say, how do we implement this in a week with your training schedule? So you're not just sore and tired and under recovered. Because I think all that stuff is it's just so easy to do. and sometimes there's situations where when you're working with an athlete, the best thing to do is to not have them lift. Yeah, for whatever reason, I've had a bunch of runners that have gone through medical school, and they've also had some kind of performance goal. So they want to qualify for Boston, or they want to qualify for the Olympic trials, or whatever it is. And as we've gone through that, at some point, the schedule gets so full that it just makes more sense to just not lift. And I think that there are times when the best thing you can do, make sure you're training consistently, control the variables you can, and don't lift weights. Don't do anything else. Just because it doesn't make sense to add in one more thing, because we could easily just tip the scales in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you need to be spooning things out of the bucket.
Yeah.
That was me in PT school. I was working for Dr. Axe, and I had a very grueling schedule in terms of classwork, and I was in the clinic, and you would see me on break, and I would be doing rear foot elevated split squats with body weight because I couldn't get to the gym. I had to eat lunch. Otherwise, I would just be a hot mess. And I think that's tough, especially if people do grow accustomed to having resistance training as part of their routine, and then all of a sudden to pull back. Because like you said earlier, I think the message is always lift heavy, high contraction intensity, load the tendons, but I think that, yeah, there's definitely a time and place to plug back and to realize that target is always moving in terms of your ecosystem. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. And going back to the idea that, you got to know the person. This has been studied specifically with plyometrics. So there's a study by Mark Hudson and colleagues that looked at, what happens if we implement a plyometric program with runners, and what happens with their bone mineral density. So that's been studied a lot. We've studied that in elementary school kids, studied that in, older adults, and how implementing something like that, plyometrics, again, a little different than resistance training, but, go with me here. That when people implemented that, their bones got denser. And if a denser bone is going to be less likely to fracture, stress fractures obviously happen a lot with runners. We don't want those to happen. But if the subjects didn't have normal menstrual function, which is an indicator of hormone function, they didn't see those same benefits. Our good friend Becca McConville, I've asked her this multiple times on studies that look at implementing exercise at a caloric deficit and how often that can have a negative impact on your skeleton, make your bones less dense, less strong, higher risk of fracture. Even specific nutrients like carbohydrates, restricting carbohydrates, if those aren't where you want them to be, you can see your body start to take away some of those resources that are in your bones. And so again, if we add in lifting in someone's situation that is not where we want it to be, I think we can make things worse. And that's often studied in females. We see a lot more research coming out in males too with this kind of stuff, where not with exercise specifically, but with fracture risk, and how males will run into this too. They just tend to need a little bit greater of a deficit, more a bigger problem. So that's when you hear things like just start squatting heavy, just start doing this stuff. It's like, yeah, if your life is going well and your health is in order and those kind of things. And then there's sometimes where they just need to run more, where I put up a poll the other day. I want to get your take on this because, you coach a whole lot of people, and, I asked if you have an athlete that is training on a consistent manner, define however you want to, is it going to be better for them to add more training or to add in resistance training? And, 60 or 70 people responded and said, I think 91% of them said add in resistance training. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. I think that most of the time you need to train more.
Yeah.
So what's your sense of that as a coach? And I guess we can talk about that from a running perspective first. And if you want to touch on triathlon too, we can do that.
Yeah, well, I think that there are certain people who absolutely, it's like they need to be training more. And I think that we need to discuss a Yamaguchi study from 2022 that basically showed that training volume, if we're talking about marathon performance, training volume is associated with marathon performance. So, you want people to have a higher monthly training volume. You want their average long run to be over 10K. You want their average, their typical training run to be over 10K. You want their average long run to be over 21K. So, before I start trying to pull levers with athletes, if we stick with running, I need to first just look at their schedule. How often are they training? Are they tolerating the workloads? And I mean, you and I we're licensed physical therapists, so we're always going to say, okay, well, what's your past medical history too? But I do think that a lot of people need to, if we talk about recreational distance runners, they need to up their running volume. And I know we're trying to get away from mileage, but it's tough to when you have races that are grounded in mileage. It's not like, hey, we're going to see who can cover the most distance in 3 hours or 2 hours. It's like all these races are grounded in mileage. So that, of course, that's what anyone's going to talk about. I just wrapped up a session with a kid who is, he runs at a D1 program, and he had a quad strain. And I was saying, hey, how's training going? He's like, good. I ran 68 miles last week. Next week, I'm looking to get to 75. I said, what's your target? He's like, I'm looking to get up to 100 miles. All right. His performance has steadily improved over this time without really doing any resistance training. Now, I think he has to be very careful because he's going to be almost bumping the ceiling. I think that when he finishes his spring season, as you and I always talk about, like, that's when we start to incorporate the resistance training. We pull back on the volume. So it's really just understanding where someone is, what their goals are, and how to ebb and flow over the course of a training year.
And I want to touch on that seasonality, because I do think that that's really important. If you're going to add in lifting, and then sometimes when you maybe shouldn't add in lifting. But yeah, I think if you look at people that are trying to compete at the highest level of wherever they are, whether we're talking about high school kids running locally or maybe in regional meets, college kids running in, conference, regional, national meets, or adults or pros, the people that are generally at the top of the list, they run a lot.
Yeah. Every day.
And every day, and with them, a lot of times it's doubles, they might be doing 10, 11 sessions a week. And so I think there's a genetic component to that. There's some people that they can just, we've talked about this before. There's some people that just can take some training, man. Like, they can run a lot.
Magnus, probably.
They can run. Yeah, they can run fast. They can run a lot of volume. They don't need as long of buildups to maybe a competition as other people need. Some of that's genetic. Some of that's probably whatever they've got going on health-wise, life circumstances. Like, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. But when you look at the best of the best, there might be some variability in what that total number is, whether you're looking at it in mileage or time or whatever, but they're training a lot. It's the same thing in triathlon, right? Like, they're training a lot. And resistance training can be a part of that, but it's not going to make it to where you can train half as much as you would have had to meet whatever goal it is. And going back to your example of that kid, I talk about seasonality with my high school and college kids all the time, adults too, but adults are a little easier sometimes, I think, because really most of them are going to have really 2 key races a year. Not all of them, but most of them. It's like, I'm going to do, this is my race in the spring, this is my race in the fall. I think they can get around that a little easier. With high school and college kids, they race all the time. So if you're in college, you're racing for 9 months, 8, 9 months out of the year. For high school kids, you've got, races pretty much every weekend in the fall, and then the same thing in the spring. And so you want to have, I want to have those times in the off season. That's when you build strength. So right now I've got high school kids in a few hours after we're done talking. We can lift heavy right now. We've been lifting for about 6 weeks. So tonight we're going to do heavy trap bar deadlifts. That's relative to each of them. We're going to do some med ball throws. We're going to do a lot of single leg work. Like they meet with me twice a week. They've all been consistent since the really the start of November. We can do a lot, and we can do a lot now, so we can get away with a whole lot less during the season. And I think it should always be this ebb and flow where I've got 12 weeks. Now is when I focus on getting strong. And then I'm trying to maintain that as much as I can during the season. And maybe that's when you're like, you can do, I want you to go down to your school weight room. I want you to do a couple sets of deadlifts. I want you to do one single leg exercise. And I just want you to try to keep your numbers about where they are. But you're just trying to maintain it. So then when you come back in the next off season, you're not starting back from zero. I have kids that go off to varying colleges, big schools, small schools, close to me in the Midwest, far away. Every program has a different approach to resistance training in the collegiate world. Some people don't lift at all. I had a girl years ago, I trained her and her sister. She said that their strength coach would have them do basically 20 minutes of shoulder exercises and no lower body stuff because they stressed their body enough with running. They didn't need to do any more legs. But when I have those kids that I know they're going off to college and I'm not going to see them for 9 months and they're not going to lift, is it really going to be beneficial to lift in the summer? Because you're probably just going to lose a lot of that. Now, maybe it's going to build you some confidence and maybe you like doing it. I've had those conversations a lot, but if you need to stay consistent with this stuff for the benefits that you're going to get, just like with training, they're going to go away.
Yeah. And I think that, if you are going to pull back, I always use the saying, at least keep touching the weights.
Yeah.
And that's something I find is very important, especially, as both of us are getting older. I mean, I have a few years on you, but I definitely crave resistance training. But if we take a step back, a great example of running volume would be myself last year. So I went to race a Eugene Marathon. I went down with my buddy Johnny, who to support him. It was his first race back after a car accident. And I did it on a whim, So now I've built a monster base over time. I'm 44. I've been training consistently for the past 15 years. But in that race, I had a good race. I ran a 250, hooray me. But I could have run a lot faster and I didn't have the volume. And if you look, and I nailed my nutrition, I know what I'm doing with lifting. But if you look at my pacing, I started to trail off a little bit towards the end. And I know that if I had done more volume leading up to that, because my longest run was 14 miles going into that. And that was just a couple weeks out because I'm like, I'd better at least put in a long run at a pretty challenging pace to just sort of rehearse my pacing for the race. But I could have come in easily 7.5 minutes faster had I done more volume. I was hovering probably around 40 miles, because that's sort of like what I would be doing if I were prepping for a half or a full Ironman. But if I was just road racing, I would definitely up my volume. Triathlon, a little bit different because you're doing these other sports and you're essentially having to really be calculated with how you're staggering your workouts because you have 3 disciplines combined into one. But yeah, people are like, oh, what would you have done differently? Easy, run more, right?
Yeah. But like you mentioned, it's just like with lifting though. It's like run more, but then take a break. Not a complete break. Just like with lifting, like you need to have times when you're not doing as much, but you still should be doing the thing that you like doing. So you shouldn't stop running cold turkey because the transition back in that's going to be rough. But you need time to adapt to these things. And with lifting, it's the same thing with training. It's years. It's looking at years of this. It's not, I don't think it's not looking at, a week or, a half a year or one race or, it's building this stuff over time, to build the qualities in your body, whether it's mental or physical, that, puts you in a good situation for success. And that stuff it takes a long time, and the programming is boring. Whether we're talking about running or lifting, I don't program that many exercises. I feel like I probably program about 15 things. And we just do them consistently. Try to make the weight a little heavier, maybe make the movement a little faster. But that's it. So like I have some clients, like they know what they're doing. You know, we've worked together for years. Like, hey, if we're going to lift twice a week, we're going to do a squat variation on Monday, and that one's going to be really challenging. And then we're going to do some kind of knee dominant pattern on the other day, but it's not going to be as challenging. And we're going to have one day where you do some kind of heavy deadlift, and then the other day is going to be a single leg version of that. It's not as heavy. You know, it's like, it's boring, you know, but it's just progressing over time.
You have to just revel in the process too. And I think the other thing that's really important, and I don't know to what extent we've gotten into this, is you also want to bring people up to certain standards, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of times people talk about resistance training. It's like, well, what's the end goal? And, you know, you have to really sort of take a step back and say, well, we need to look at the performance demands of the sport. But I think that there are certain people who, I think back to in college, I had a friend who was a swimmer. This guy was just strong as an ox. And mm-hmm. The lifting to him, you know, probably was not as important. And he lifted, and I think that was smart of him. But, you know, he would just crush these standards. I mean, he could comfortably back squat twice his body weight. He could pull comfortably over 2 times his body weight. Like, you know, and I think that should be our goal, is to bring people up to certain standards and to just also make sure that they're completely rehabbed, because you and I both know a lot of these runners and endurance athletes go from injury to injury, and a lot of that's incomplete rehab. And I think that's where it's tricky, is like, and also I feel very fortunate to be in a position where I can identify some of this stuff, to be like, oh, you know, tell me about your past medical history. Oh, well, you had a Achilles tendinopathy. Oh, well, we can pretty much assume that you're going to have, you know, profound strength deficits involving your calf muscle complex, especially your soleus. We look at Seth O'Neill's research. So, you know, I think that's also important, is like when you're designing a strength and conditioning program, understanding that person's past medical history. Are they coming off of a bone stress injury? Do they have a history of tendinopathy? And that's really important. And it's not going to necessarily change the lift. It's just going to change the priorities a little bit. So
yeah, and you mentioned the incomplete rehab thing. I'll get runners that'll reach out to me and they'll say, you know, I've got some tendonitis in my knee, or I had this muscle strain or something like that, and I really want to start lifting. I think that sometimes, you know, we go straight through resistance training when maybe someone doesn't want to admit that you're injured right now, or you have an injury. This isn't like you need to get that sorted out first, through me, through somebody else, you know, but this is an injury right now. So we have to approach this a little differently than if we're just adding strength training into someone's programming when they're currently healthy and training. Those are 2 different situations. And you and I talk about this all the time. There's a big difference between rehab and coaching. And it's important that you define what that is. And it's not to say that someone that's healthy and training isn't going to have niggles. Things aren't going to feel great at times. Like, that does come with just kind of pushing yourself. We would see that if we were working with runners, triathletes, CrossFitters, golfers, anybody that's pushing their body a little bit. But I think it's important to realize what the focus is and what the situation is. And going back to past medical history, you know, I think that there are times that can make a drastic difference, whether you're looking at something specific with a tissue like the Achilles. You mentioned Seth O'Neill's work. People that have gone on to surgery, people that have been in a cam boot. You know, there's a great study by Coe and colleagues in 2018. I talk about this when we teach, that the time that you spend non-weight bearing or in a modified weight bearing environment, it's proportional to the loss in the density of your bones, the structure of your muscles, like all these things. And so if someone's like, Well, I had an ACL repair and I was non-weight bearing for 6 weeks, or I had a stress fracture and I was on crutches for X amount of weeks, and then they're immediately trying to plug back in. I think there's times when you're looking at those timelines, and if you're going to use resistance training as a way to build a certain quality in someone that they're not going to get from just running, that you have to respect whatever those timelines are. And sometimes that means we have to take a longer approach to this, with training, with racing, with even just starting running again.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a great point that's worth discussing is, I put something out on Instagram yesterday, which were basically summary points from Moran et al., the paper in Sports Med, just talking about the realities of, unilateral versus bilateral resistance exercise. And, I think that our goal as rehab professionals is to make sure that these runners, endurance athletes, really any athlete, but sticking with the theme of runners, that they can directly load through the involved tissue and region. And if they can't do that, throw performance out the window, right? Unless that's their only option, and then you can anticipate some compensatory strategies. But I think that's a one-time. I mean, all of my programs involve a combination of double leg, single leg. If people are healthy, we're going to incorporate some plyometric or energy storage and release. But from a rehab standpoint, we definitely want to make sure that people can directly load through each leg. And I think single leg exercises have a little bit more salience. I can think of a great example where this kid, he was in high school back then. He was a middle distance runner, and he had a snowboarding accident where he fractured a couple of his metatarsals. I don't know how he did that with his boot and the binding, but nonetheless. And obviously this kid heals pretty quick, and his dad called. He's like, the kid's just not, like, my son's just not going in the right direction. He looks very guarded. His running looks wonky. And he was working with a trainer, a reputable trainer who's worked with a lot of professional athletes, specifically in the cycling domain. And I was in the same facility, and I would watch what they do. And it was all bilateral exercises, and nothing that involved him going up on his toes, which would load the metatarsals, no jumping activities. And because I was privy to that, and I had been observing, sort of taking notes mentally, when I connected with him, I'm just like, hey, let me watch you do a calf raise. And he looked at me like he saw a ghost. So he had some kinesiophobic behavior, and he also was never challenged from a single leg standpoint. So he never restored capacity, nor did he regain confidence. And we got him back in time. But, I think that's a one instance where, you definitely with runners need to make sure they tolerate unilateral loading, as you start to migrate them out of the medical system.
Which I think is something that we miss a lot in the rehab world. Whether we're talking about rehab or down the road, if they're training and they've just been able to pick up, get back into running without, doing those kind of things. As I've said many times in here, I see a lot of stress fractures, and, the amount of times that I have a runner that has dealt with a tibial stress fracture and they've gone somewhere else, or maybe I see them for their second one, or, however we end up connecting, but they've never done anything local to the area that was broken. It's always the hip stuff. It's, I've done all these side planks, I've done all these glute bridges, I've done all these other things, but they've never done anything to directly load where the fracture site was, which is important because that's, our bones adapt in a site-specific manner, and it also allows us to check and make sure you're progressing. And they've never jumped. They've never done any kind of plyometric work, especially on one leg. And so that's when, like, the worlds of rehab and strength and conditioning I think there's some carryover in this stuff, because I think with runners, we often get scared to do those kind of things. And so, the first part of the podcast, we're talking about don't do this stuff if they're not ready. But if they're ready, like, you treat them like an athlete, and make sure that it works with their training and their life schedule, but, have them pick up heavy stuff and do things on 2 feet and things on 1 foot and throw things and jump. And because though all of that stuff should help them build some qualities they don't get from distance running, build some confidence, and hopefully put them in a better situation to tolerate training, which I think is what we're going for. Like with resistance training, my thought is we're doing this so you can tolerate training better. So you can tolerate maybe a little bit more training, you can tolerate a little faster running, and you can recover a little bit better. And not so much like do this lift so it will change your running mechanics, which again is another thing that runners will get. Like if you do this, you're going to activate this muscle more when you run, or you're going to change the way that you're moving. And I think we've pretty much seen that doesn't really happen. But I do think if you're preparing someone for the task, and we see that, running just doesn't do that completely, doesn't give you all the benefits that you get with resistance training.
Well, and what you were just describing in terms of like, pick up heavy stuff, throw stuff, jump. I mean, isn't that Dan John quadrant 2?
Yeah, of course. He talked about that when he was on our podcast.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that.
You say, I can't remember if he said that in the episode or you just say that, but it's simple, not easy.
Yeah, that's a Dan Johnism. So, and also like overarching rehab pro, load the tissue with the issue. You always say load it locally, load it, site specific, load it globally. And I think that you'll never go wrong when you're doing that. I do think a lot of resistant runners who, may say, oh, I'm not going to PT, I'm just going to do a bunch of TheraBand stuff. If so long as they're lifting heavy, I think a lot of the resistance training, if they're comfortable and they don't have any weird beliefs or negative beliefs about lifting heavy, that cleans up a lot of incomplete rehab. Not to the extent that perhaps if someone connected with us in person, but I do think that's one of the other benefits of resistance training. And I don't know who said this. I like it. I could pick it apart as a saying, but resistance training is coordination training under load. And the reason I don't like that is because one of the things that we've learned through the literature is being able to lift heavy and having good balance. These are mutually exclusive things. And I see a lot of people like, oh, I lift heavy, I don't need to do a lot of, balance work. Bullshit. You absolutely do.
Yeah.
That's why it's like a good program should involve, a heavy lift, probably with a barbell or a trap bar where you're getting greater recruitment, greater degrees of activation, and not the glutes aren't firing type activation. I mean, you're getting greater recruitment of more muscle mass. You need to put someone on one leg because a lot of people have shit balance, right? Mm-hmm. You need to challenge people from an energy storage and release standpoint. You probably need to throw things, right? Get some diagonal motion and torque going on in the system.
I can't tell you how many athletes I've had that they say, man, I just feel better when I'm lifting heavy. Or, man, I just feel better when I'm doing these single leg drills. Like when I'm just focusing on the coordination stuff that you talked about. My bias is to do both. Is there a lot of great literature to support that those are absolutely the way to go about this? No, but I've just had so many people where it's like, if you just get them lifting heavy and jumping or doing some kind of med ball work, maybe if they're a little older, and then you get them on one leg, focusing on being smooth and precise with some movements, they tend to feel a lot better, and they tend to report subjectively feeling better with stuff. And so I'm gonna stick with that for now.
Yeah, and I think from a rehab standpoint, that's really important because restoring just like that reflexive stabilization. John Keeley did a great job talking about this when Todd Hargrove had him on his podcast, Better Movement. But I do think that that's important, again, especially from a rehab standpoint. But, single leg drills for a lot of adolescent runners too, So I think, before I go barking up that tree, You know who I thought did a great job to just like lay out a simple resistance training program in a research study was Blagrove, Glenn Howinson, and I think Philip Hayes, 2018 Med Sci Sport and Exercise. If you look at their program, it's like they did I think it was a 10-week program, and it was like, okay, they're doing box jumps, they're doing hurdle jumps, they're doing a back squat, they're doing an RDL. Then, and I think week 1, they also had a single leg press. And then they got into, basically getting into step ups, throwing in some high knees, some rack pulls. It was a really practical, again, boring, but effective program. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen resistance training have this myriad of benefits from a performance standpoint. And a lot of it is through really what we would say is like garbage programming, right?
Yeah.
But I thought that study did a nice job, and it showed that it improved running economy. It improved strength. They did put on a little bit of mass, but that's okay. It's probably healthy. That's what probably keeps people on the right side of the fence with injury, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Rich obviously is one of the best in the world at this stuff. He was on the podcast before. Anybody listening, the studies that Chris and I are talking about, they're all in the show notes. And we'll also put Rich's book in there, which is also really good. And yeah, I think that's one of the studies that when you look at the studies that have looked at resistance training and distance running, that's one of the ones that looks like an actual program, and yeah. I'm not going to pretend to know how to study this stuff in a lab, but a lot of times when you look at the programming for looking at whether resistance training lowers your risk of injury or improves your performance or whatever things you're trying to measure, the programming doesn't look super practical. Or something that I would provide to a client, or you would probably provide to a client. And that one did. And so, yeah, it's, simple stuff. Be consistent, be progressive, keep it simple.
Yeah, the progressive piece is important. And I think that with that study, I mean, that was in younger athletes. They did pull their volume back, and they essentially replaced it with this resistance training. So, I mean, that would run a little bit contrary to what we were talking about before, but I don't recall if they commented on the specifics of their running program in terms of frequency and duration. So now these runners could have very well already been running in adequate volume. So, they pulled back a little bit, plugged in the resistance training, and that's why we saw these changes. But yeah, I thought that was a good study, And also, the other thing too, if someone isn't resistance training, you could have them do anything that is a stimulus above and beyond what they encounter with their training and day-to-day activities. And that's Rich's study from 2018, the systematic review that he did with Glenn as well. It's like, get someone doing anything. Let's not complicate it, because you're creating a much bigger chasm to cross, Yeah. And that's when you can get away with some single leg stuff. You can get away with body weight stuff. But after a while, that's going to have diminishing returns. Like doing body weight for me probably is not going to push the needle too much. And you have to really understand, and they talked about this in the Moran study, you need to really understand biomechanics if you're going to try and solely rely on body weight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an easy thing for people to go to, because you don't need equipment. And I think there's a lot less fear and apprehension. I mean, I've been with, specifically with high school kids, and going into the weight room, and there's football players in there, or there's other people in there, and there can be a lot of apprehension or intimidation about, I'm going into an environment I'm not particularly used to. This is new to me. And so I think it can become, I'm wearing different clothes, and so I think that can be an intimidating thing, which is part of the reason why I think sometimes people just don't. Like, I'm just not going to go in there. We can take bands to the trail. We can, do some other things. And again, I think that when you add that stuff in, if you haven't done anything like that, push-ups, planks, side planks, single leg squats, like anything with your body weight. A lot of people will see some improvements, but like you said, you're gonna run out of that improvement pretty quick, and there needs to be a progression. And I think often you kind of set into a set of drills with if you're a team or even if you're an individual, these are my exercises that I do, and this is what I'm going to do. And if you like doing them because there's a ritual to it, I think that's okay, but you're probably not getting anything more than just the mental aspect of that. If you're not progressing some kind of variable within that, whether it's the weight you're using, the reps you're performing, the speed of movement, whatever it is that you're trying to progress, it has to be progressed, or your body doesn't see a reason to improve anymore.
I think a great example. I mean, the whole reason we did the Cinder Block series is for what we're describing. For people who don't have a background in resistance training, you have a $3 implement that you can get probably if you just took a walk around your neighborhood. I'm always amazed. I see cinder blocks everywhere. That's 35 pounds that you can step on, you can jump over, you can press overhead, you can hold in your hand, you can hold in a goblet position. And if you look at that programming, it's simple and it's progressive and it's nothing fancy. And are there some concessions that we need to make? Of course, right? But those constraints are also what seem to have a unique benefit to any program too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if Dan John was talking about this in one of his books, but these runners are not going to want to go into a weight room where the football team, the lacrosse team, soccer team is training. You need to bring the weights to the track, whether that's a cinder block, some kettlebells, and you can do a whole hell of a lot of good because these are untrained people. I mean, you could just tell them to go and flip over some car tires and it would create probably an adequate stimulus. Though don't do that. Yeah. Because those are not technically exercise equipment. Someone got sued, I think.
Yeah.
In the judge or the jury, I think it was a judge ruled that, that trainer was liable because technically that monster truck tire is not a piece of exercise equipment.
Yeah. So be careful with your cinder blocks.
Yeah. And spray them so you seal in because they can shed a little bit. Yeah. So any other things that we didn't touch on that would be good to, I mean, so do you think it would be good to walk through like a sample program for someone?
Sure. Yeah. And the person who I mark all this, I can mark all this now, which makes it a lot easier. The person that's coming to work on our furnace should be here shortly. So if he gets here, I'll pause real quick.
Okay. So yeah, I think it would be good to just give people a sample lens into let's give listeners some context, and then we can talk about our programming and rationale. I almost want to talk about the fellow who I just finished a session with, because he's running 60 miles a week right now, to almost give you a lens into what he did today. And he's still, even though he's running, like in my estimation, he is a patient. We can do that. Yeah, we can do that, and then we can contrast that with the high school kids that I'll train tonight that are in their off season, and it's there's 4 of them at a time, so they're all working from the same program. Okay, so just to give people a little bit of context, this is a fellow who runs in the ACC, D1 runner, strained his quad. He sort of had an aberrant step when he was running pretty fast. And this is an atypical injury. You don't hear of quad strains in runners. You tend to hear of them in soccer players. I dealt with a quad strain kicking a wet soccer ball on goal, and I probably was just not quite prepared for the additional weight of the ball, coupled with kicking it pretty hard, trying to rifle a shot like 30 yards out. And so he had this quad strain, and what happened? They took him into the ATC room. This isn't to knock ATCs. These are people who are young, they're in training, they're getting the reps. And I don't know who ended up designing the program, but they started doing, not the ATC, I think this is someone else at this point, but they started doing a lot of needling and stretching. So what did he develop? Myositis ossificans. All right.
Ooh.
So he has this
fun.
palpable defect in like the anterior, like mid portion of his thigh, and he's just lost capacity. And I took him through some strength testing using the Mark 10 dynamometer, got some baseline numbers, profound quad deficit, and he also was having pain and some reluctance to loading. So you have to be careful of how much you look into that. But the first day we got him going, that was the initial consultation. So it was 3 weeks today from the time of that initial consultation, and he's doing a hell of a lot better. So what did I run him through today? Got to my facility and basically walked for 10 minutes, 5 minutes at 3.2 miles per hour, 5 minutes at 3.5 miles per hour. I took him through 2 simple 1-minute passes of a marching matrix. Then I took him through loaded carries. And again, this is not someone who looks like a football linebacker, right? Relatively thin kid, doesn't have a lot of strength capacity in his upper body, but took him through 3 1-minute passes of farmer marches with 20 kilogram kettlebells. Then we went through 3 sets of rear foot elevated split squats, holding a dumbbell in a goblet position. I had him work up to an 8 out of 10, and we went 25, 35, 45. And he essentially got like 15, 12, 8 reps. All right. The goal is to get him lifting a little bit heavier, but he was in that 6 to 15 rep range. I didn't take him to failure. We're not trying to necessarily focus on hypertrophy with this particular individual. I had him go to barbell lateral toe taps. So heavy barbell lateral toe taps, which are going to replicate mid stance a little bit. Then I had him do step ups with a Bulgarian bag on his back, 2 sets of 12 to 15 alternating between sides, a band resisted row in a staggered stance. And then we got into some knee extension isometrics on a Nautilus machine where he did 3 sets of 5-second holds with equivalent of probably like 75-80% of a 1 rep max. And then I had him do something to load the calf, and he tolerated everything great. So that's starting no jumping quite yet. That would be the next step. And he's fine if he wants to do pogo jumps. I told him, I said, if you want to do some A skips and pogo jumps, you're fine, because that's really a below the knee exercise. It's challenging some rhythm and coordination. But, we would want to get him to some, counter movement jumps onto or box jumps, and then sort of see how he tolerates those before progressing him. So that would be like starting to look at a little bit of a late stage rehab, and give us a lens into what you're up to with some of the high school kids tonight.
Yeah, very similar. So most of my high school kids.
Yeah, similar, of course, because a good rehab program should always start to mirror resistance. A good conditioning program.
Yeah, absolutely. So context on these ones: all healthy high school kids, boys and girls, sophomore to senior. Some of them I've treated as patients in the past, but everybody's healthy and training now. So they lift with me twice a week. The first session was on Monday. Today is Thursday. At this point in the off season, they're running on a consistent basis with the team. There's not really a bunch of workouts on the schedule. That'll probably happen at the start of February. So we're a couple weeks out from that. They've all been lifting for about 6, 7, 8 weeks, depending on when their seasons ended up and how much recovery they felt like they needed afterwards. So they've been doing this for a little bit. So tonight, what we'll do, we'll go through a standard warm-up. They'll jog outside for a couple minutes, get their legs loose. We'll go through a dynamic warm-up, very similar to what lots of runners go through. And then we'll go through a couple more coordination-type movements. So we'll do some band pull-aparts with marching. We'll do lateral toe taps with a band. We'll go through hip airplanes. They do hip airplanes 2 days a week. Earlier in the week, they did them with no band for a large range of motion. Tonight, they'll do them with a band. That's kind of their warm up. And then we'll go through 2 med ball exercises. We'll do some rotational throws as well as some overhead throws. They do that partnered up because I like them having to catch. And then we'll go into trap bar deadlifts, 3 sets of 5, making that last rep tough but doable. Then we'll do some step ups with dumbbells on each side. We'll do a push up hold, sort of like a plank. We won't do any loaded carries tonight because the deadlift will force them to hold some weight. We did that earlier in the week. We will do calf raises with weight. They don't do pogo. They don't do hopping variations tonight. They did that on Monday. So that's how we challenge your calf on Monday. Tonight, they'll do single leg calf raises with weight. And then we'll do a couple fun crawling exercises, more for coordination and because they think it's funny. I posted about this on my Instagram with my high school kids. The number one thing that I want is that we've made progress in the things we're doing and they've had fun. And so there always has to be an element of fun with this. Like in my experience, runners tend to not respond well to like a lot of aggressive coaching, like think about your stereotypical like football coach yelling in your face and all those kind of things. Some of these kids have had that before and they don't really like that. So I try to stay pretty loose with the environment the entire time because I just want to make sure that they are developing a little bit of enjoyment with lifting, and we get some work done, and they show up consistently for the off season. So, but that's what we're going to do tonight, and then they'll go home.
That's probably a lot more than the people that they're competing against.
Yeah. Yeah. You can get a lot done. That's the other thing. Like if you're efficient, you can get a lot of stuff done. You don't always have to, but like if you're moving and you've got it organized, you can accomplish a lot of things that'll take them 45 to 50 minutes.
And yeah, I mean, the thing that's going to take the most time is probably just resting between the trap bar deadlifts. I think with a lot of these other exercises, it's like when you feel like you're ready to go again, go.
Yeah, go again.
It's like do a set on the left, do a set on the right, do a set on the left, do a set on the right. Yeah, it's the the meat and potatoes, the compound movements that obviously tend to be a little bit more time consuming because of the interset rest period.
Yeah, and they did rear foot elevated split squats on Monday. They all did. And so that's the one on Monday night. It's like, these should be hard. You should have to rest a little bit. I don't want you going to failure, but like you should feel like you're working. And that's kind of how I will have conversations with them about this. I'll use reps in reserve. That's something we've talked about before every once in a while. But with my high school kids, and this is where I think just having some experience with this, like I can tell if you're using enough weight. Like there's a look to it, like going back to Dan John, he talks about there's certain instances where like you shouldn't be making any faces and you shouldn't be like grunting or exhaling loudly. Like your last rep should look tough with a split squat or with a deadlift. And if it doesn't, we can probably add some weight as long as they're cool with it. So, I think that you want stuff like that is helpful. You don't always have to be super formulaic, but it doesn't mean that you should just be, nonchalant with lifting.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, to expand on that point, I'll tell you what, I feel like there's so much we still have to learn about resistance training. Yeah. His easy strength program is incredible. And I do a hybrid version of it. And I think he just released a new, like the Omni easy strength book, but easy strength is essentially you're picking 5 lifts for people who are unfamiliar with it. Type in Dan John easy strength, and we can put that in the show notes. But it's essentially you're picking 5 lifts and you're doing 2 sets of 8 to 10, I think. And it's using moderate weight. You're not allowed to grunt, grimace, and you're doing this every day. And I think he does it for maybe 50 days. I have never felt better. I've done this easy strength program on 3 separate occasions in the past 2 years, and I'm never sore. I always feel recovered, and I just feel great mentally and physically. There's a lot of other factors that go into that, but I think that that's an incredible program, especially for a lot of master level athletes. And so I've experimented, probably similar to you. I've experimented so much on myself over the years, and you learn a lot. And obviously, you have to be careful because of the N of 1 scenario. But for folks who haven't tried Dan John's program, and everyone's saying you got to lift heavy as shit and la la la, go on that program and watch yourself get stronger. Do some baseline strength tests, do the easy strength, and then repeat those tests and watch all your numbers go up.
Yeah, absolutely.
He said a lot of his greatest lifts and records came after easy strength. So,
yeah, makes sense.
Any other final thoughts, comments, words of wisdom?
So we've done this before, but we'll see if your answer changes. I think we should finish with one question. If you personally could only do one exercise, one lift, however you want to define that.
Down to one. Yeah.
You can only do one, and it's you personally. This is not for your patients or clients. You can only do one for the rest of your life. What would you choose?
I would choose a trap bar deadlift because now when we've talked about this before, we said my response was farmer march, trap bar deadlift. Farmer march, it's integrity under load, as Dan describes it. You get the single leg component. It's grip, strength, balance, breathing, trunk control. It just checks so many boxes. The only thing you're not doing is bending your lower extremity. But I would say trap bar deadlift because what I would do if I could only do this exercise, I would do a relatively heavy trap bar deadlift, and then I would hold it at the top position maybe for a little bit. So like go up, hold for 3 to 5 seconds, and repeat. And I feel like that would check a lot of boxes.
Yeah, it's a good answer.
How about you?
I'm not going to choose the same one as you because that would be lame. So I'm going to choose a front squat. Similar reasons though, because you can load that pretty heavy. It's challenging to your torso and upper body. So you kind of get a little bit of both. It's pretty functional for what you have to do in life. Yeah, I would choose a front squat.
Aren't you worried about quad dominance, though?
Oh, that's true. True, man. Let me start falling over the place because my other muscles forget how to work. Yeah, I want quad dominant runners. We didn't talk about this today. We've talked about that before. I would rather have you have a heavy squat than a heavy deadlift.
Yeah. I would agree too.
I think there's more carryover with squatting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm on a back squatting routine, man. Like every time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have to be careful with depth. I mean, that's the one thing with a lot of exercises. Like there was a time when I would try to squat super deep and I would deadlift. I would do conventional deadlifts from the floor. And as I've gotten older, I'm like, nah, we're going to go to a little bit above parallel, and we'll just stick with that because my hips feel better when I do that. So I do think that you have to be, you need to be mindful of that and what your body's telling you. Unless you have to do it for your sport or your activity. If you're a CrossFitter, you probably have to do some of that stuff. But if you're a runner, or you're just trying to be active and healthy, you don't have to.
Yeah, if someone has a background where they've been doing full depth back squats or ass to grass squats, as a lot of people call them, that's fine. Yeah. But I've seen a lot of people get into trouble with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. I back squat relatively heavy, depending where we are in the season relative to a race. But I just feel so much better, and I crave back squats right now. Any squat I crave, and I mix it up between back squats and front squats. But I don't go past 90. Every time I do, I start bitching and moaning, and Mimi's like, my partner, my wife, she's like, you were doing squats again, weren't you? And I'm like,
grumpy.
Yeah, my knees are a little bit cranky. And
you're getting grumpy.
So I just go down, touch my bottom on a bench. I don't unload. I touch my bottom and come back up. And
You're going to rupture a
there's
disc.
good research.
That,
I mean,
man.
they've taken.
You're going to hurt yourself.
What's it? Yeah.
You're going to rupture a disc.
Don't say it, man. I'm not lifting today as a function of that. I'm going to do a wall sit.
There you go. Just keep it.
So,
go into preservation mode. Side note, I've talked about my mom before. If you're on my newsletter, so she had a kidney transplant when I was a kid, and I remember her going to. She saw her nephrologist. That's the doctor that you see if you had a transplant. She had just turned 50, and she's in her early 60s now. And he basically told her she's really active and does a lot of stuff. And he was like, you should just go into preservation mode. My mom didn't take that advice. Also didn't like that advice.
Yeah. I mean, that's bullshit. It's like the power of words, right?
Yeah. I'm like, don't listen to him. He's good at kidneys. Don't listen to his advice on exercise. Yeah. Great with kidneys. Take the kidney advice.
Yeah. You have to pick and choose.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, I'll let you get to your furnace guy. Is he knocking at the door?
Not yet, man. We'll see. We'll see what he has to say. Always exciting. Love having a house,
Cool. We'll put all this in the show notes. We're going to be doing some teaching. We're trying to finalize some dates in 2023. So the easiest place to stay up to date is, we'll obviously post on social media. You can connect with us through our newsletter, though, if you're not going to open it, we don't want you on our newsletter. But you can find those on our websites, chrisjohnsonpt.com, runningmatekc.com. That's probably the best place to learn from us. And
I'll put those in the show notes too. So if you're looking to subscribe to our newsletter, that's the easiest way to stay up to date on this stuff. You can just click in the show notes.
Cool. All right. Well, we hope everyone who has tuned in is doing well. You're off to the start of a great 2023, the year of the rabbit. And other than that, thanks as always for listening and for your support.
Yep. Have a good day, everybody. That was good. That's probably